Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new TEAM therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda and Matt.
It's good to see you both.
Yeah, it's good to have you guys. Good to have you again, Matt, and good to be here with David. I was going to say, David, into your lunatic face. So let me start with that was kind of embarrassing. Let me start with an endorsement. You're so kind. You give away a lot of free material on your website, including a depression class that's for free. And someone wrote to you so kindly about that free depression class. Thank you so much. I learned English just to read your books so I could learn how to feel good and be happy. And they are being incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for all the dedication and solidarity of your work and for saving my life and the lives of many others. I hope you and your team are also feeling very good. And that's from Auntie.
How do you spell the name?
Anty.
Auntie. Well, wow, thank you, Auntie. And Auntie must be one brilliant person to learn a language so fast. But that's very touching. Thank you, Auntie. Well, let's dive in. We got hundreds of questions following a talk I gave on treatment of anxiety disorders. Just a couple of days ago. So we're going to answer as many as we can, and we're just thrilled to have, again, the wonderful and brilliant Dr. Matt May with us, so you can get all kinds of high-quality expertise.
Okay, well, here's the first question. Hello, Dr. Burns. Could you tell us more about dependency on anxiolytics like tranquilizers, which you already explained to me meant Xanax, Ativan, and Valium, and how to inform the client about that?
You want to take that one, Matt?
Yeah, I can do that. I think when people are talking about dependency, they could mean a couple of different things. It could be a physiological dependency where they go through withdrawal symptoms that could include increase in blood pressure. And in severe cases, people can have a seizure if they're withdrawing too abruptly from a benzodiazepine.
Like Xanax or Valium or Ativan or Librium, any of those.
Is that the same thing as an anti-anxiolytic?
Yeah, that just means minor tranquilizers.
Oh.
And I think there's also a psychological dependence that people can develop on a medication, and where they imagine that they need that in order to overcome their anxiety. And when talking about it with patients, it's important, of course, to understand where they're coming from, which is that anxiety is terrible. This feeling panic attacks are just awful nightmares. And Rhonda, you were commenting earlier that people really suffer when they have anxiety, and so they're desperate for something that will be effective and help them calm down and feel better. And benzodiazepines have that effect in the short term. And there are many problems, though, with them, which is that people develop dependence on those. They need higher and higher doses. And then there are side effects like, impairment in reflexes, more frequent falls, motor vehicle accidents can occur at a higher rate. And so I have a lot of concerns about the use of these medications when they're very safe treatments for anxiety that don't pose a real risk to life and limb. And I have more to say, but maybe we could open it up to Dr. Burns.
Well, just very quickly, when I'm treating someone and they're coming for the treatment of anxiety and they're on an anti-anxiety drug like Xanax or Ativan or whatever, I just tell them that I don't actually use these agents in the treatment of anything. And while they're temporarily very effective for anxiety, if you take them regularly for 3 weeks or more, you'll get addicted to it. And then when you try to get off of them, you'll have increased anxiety and insomnia, the intense, which is why you took them in the first place. And then you'll wrongly think, and your doctor will wrongly think, you can't get off of them. So if you want me to treat you, I treat everyone with drug-free treatments for anxiety. And if you want me to treat you, then you would have to let me supervise the gradual tapering off of your benzo at the beginning of therapy. And if so, I'd love to work with you. If that doesn't appeal to you, there are tons of doctors in the community who will be prescribing these kinds of drugs for anxiety. And if you want to do that, go for it. And if it doesn't work out and you want to come back and check me out at some future time, my door is always open. To you. That's how I do it. And that makes it kind of simple.
Well, yeah, I think it's, I like that approach. And I think it's sometimes useful to explain the reasoning, like why the methodology that I would have to offer, including exposure and response prevention, couldn't work if they were taking a medication in response to their anxiety. That becomes a response that they would ideally be preventing in order to face their anxiety without any, protection around them, so they could completely prove to themselves that they're safe. And if they're taking a pill instead, my worry is that they're learning something different. They're learning that they needed that in order to feel better, and they're getting a reward for taking the pill that makes it more likely to have the anxiety. My sense is that it reinforces the anxiety if you then give it a treat, kind of like if you give a dog a treat.
Go ahead. My colleague Henny Westra is a brilliant research psychologist in Canada and a fantastic clinician as well. And she did a review of the world literature. It's about 20 years old, but it's still valid, on drugs versus psychotherapy in the treatment of anxiety. And she concluded not only that cognitive therapy, or we should say cognitive behavioral therapy, or TEAM, where you're using exposure and all these new techniques, not only is it more effective than treating anxiety with benzodiazepines, but these drugs will actually make it impossible to be cured from anxiety, because you're addicted to a drug, and as soon as you try to go off it, your anxiety is gonna skyrocket. So that's the approach that I've also taken, and other people do it differently, and it's a free world, and there's a lot of different approaches, but I just want to stay out of the deep end of the pool if you can't swim.
That's a good analogy. Yeah, I think it just makes common sense too that if someone is suffering and having a lot of anxiety and panic attacks, you wouldn't recommend that they go to the bar every day and have a shot.
I wouldn't go too far. No, we don't want to take away the really good stuff.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, the really good stuff, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, the anti-anxiety agents are actually anti-therapeutic because they're promoting the idea you should control your anxiety. You should try to subdue it. And the cure is to try to freak out, bring it on. That's what I talked about in my talk, and I gave a lot of examples of how this can have really fast, dramatic effects. So, what else?
Okay,
do you
here's
have
another
for
question.
Us there?
You always talk about how team therapy is rapid, and somebody asked you.
Not rapid; it's vapid.
Oh.
That's why it lingers.
Really
vapid therapy lingers longer.
So that's the question. Does the therapy, if it's rapid, linger? Yeah. Rapid or vapid? Does it linger?
Well, research, and I'll get Matt's take on this, shows that the faster you recover and the more dramatically you recover, the better the long-term prognosis, the fewer relapses. But you always have to do relapse prevention training. after a person recovers, because the probability of at least some relapse is 100%. And so I don't care if my patients relapse. I just want them to know what to do when they relapse. We all relapse. A relapse is a minute or more of feeling like crap. And given that definition, we all relapse all the time. But if you know the tools that work for you, those tools will always work for you. And so we practice how to handle the relapse thoughts before I terminate the patient. And that seems to work really, really well. If you don't do that, you're in for trouble. Man?
I love that answer. I thought that was a perfect answer. I wouldn't change anything.
Okay.
Okay, well, here's a part 2 of that question. Is the rapid response that you're talking about merely first aid?
Yes, it is. This is a little known fact. I wanted to interject a little.
Rutherford Knows is back.
Well, this person asked, am I right in assuming that the sustained work of therapy, like psychodynamic therapy, body work, et cetera, will still be required?
Yes, absolutely, and it will go on generally for many years, and at substantial cost, but I might say reward for the therapist. And then this will help us stabilize our incomes. What think you, Dr. May?
I don't think any additional treatment is usually required for that problem. Once you achieve the outcome of resolution of the anxiety, then you can have relapses, but you will also have the tool and know how to apply it on your own anytime you have a relapse.
I might say in general that the rapid recovery that we see in TEAM-CBT is not just for anxiety disorders, which is what my talk was on, but for depression as well. And this has to be handled carefully because it's so disturbing to people. I guess Rhonda said I'm not supposed to talk about this anymore, but the people feel a need to write this off because it's so ingrained in our culture that therapy takes years. I was
didn't
trained
say that
way. Okay, well, you didn't say that. I was trained that way in a resident. Remember last time we recorded that you scolded me for something like that.
No, I said, please don't talk about a patient work that you had done that nobody knew what you were talking about because it wasn't relevant to the topic of that particular podcast.
Oh, I thought anything I say would be relevant and exciting. Yeah, you're right. I remember that now. Thank you. But yeah, the people can't believe that people can recover quickly. I usually treat people in a single 2-hour therapy session. I think, Matt, you're seeing people recover in 3, 4, 5 sessions, and people find this unbelievable, and most welcome it, but some are quite enraged, and they have to discredit. Oh, you're not doing the deep work, and you're not treating the causes, and you're just a kind of a psychological band-aid. And when I hear that, to tell you the truth, it kind of ticks me off. But I can understand too, because if I had heard this early in my career, I wouldn't have believed it either. What's your take on that, Mr. Bandage Man?
I like applying bandages to anyone who's bleeding. The rate of recovery, I think, is unpredictable. I don't like to build up expectations in others or make them imagine that they should be recovering any faster than they are. And at the same time, my intention in every session is for that individual to recover in that session. Mm-hmm. And when people are imagining there's some kind of deeper thing that has to be uncovered, sometimes there are hidden emotions that can be elusive and take some time to guess at and figure out, that can be causing anxiety or other symptoms. But whatever we're feeling, if we're feeling upset, whatever is creating that is present right there in that moment. The thoughts that are causing those feelings are thoughts that we're actively having. And so we don't need to go back into childhood and try to figure out what happened there. The feelings we're having right now are created by the thoughts we're having right now. And then once we know how to untwist that thinking, we instantly feel better. And there's nothing else to do once you're feeling joyful.
Cool. I love it.
Love it too. Hey, so can you discuss any published or ongoing empirical research on the efficacy of team therapy?
Let me say right off the top, we need some controlled outcome studies, and we'll never get the respect we deserve, hopefully deserve until we get that. But I am pushing colleagues now, let's start doing some research. And one paper is being prepared that you're aware of, Rhonda, on a small pilot study done at the Feeling Good Institute on 38 severely depressed and anxious first responders who were treated free as part of a project of the Feeling Good Institute.
Well, it was a project of Feeling Good Foundation.
Yeah, the Feeling Good Foundation, which I guess has some connection to the
Well,
Feeling
it's the
Good
nonprofit
Institute.
arm of the Feeling Good Institute.
Who was the treasurer of that?
I was.
Yeah. And so they sent me the data on these 38 people from the first thing to the conclusion of the therapy, and I analyzed it using conventional methods plus structural equation modeling, which does a better job of estimating parameters. When you have missing data in any long-term study, you have some people who forget to complete the scales, or they drop out, or whatever. But the data looked great, and I compared it with 45 outcome studies published with cognitive therapy, traditional cognitive therapy. And I think that what the results showed, that in 4 sessions, the ones treated with TEAM-CBT, these 38 first responders, and by the way, their initial depression level was the same as in these 45 outcome studies for cognitive therapy. The outcome studies for cognitive therapy, there was about a 50% reduction in symptoms by the end of therapy. In the TEAM group, there was about a 75% reduction in symptoms in only 4 sessions. And so the team was showing a 50% better, quicker, better results than traditional cognitive therapy or any other form of therapy for that matter, because there's no form of therapy that does better than 50% improvement during the course of therapy. So that's very promising. It's not a controlled outcome study, so we can't draw scientific conclusions, but it is interesting and promising. And then also in my book, Feeling Great, I published, again, it was just a naturalistic, informal study. I treated 40 consecutive severe trauma patients, and I treated all of them just with 1 2-hour session. And most of them had pretty much complete recovery by the end of the session. On average, I think there was a 91% reduction in depression in those people, which is, way better than any form of psychotherapy gets, even in two years. But again, that was me. And, we can't, other team therapists, I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years and, getting data at every session and really learning how to do it. But we need to get people like Matt and David and Jacob Towery and Jill Levitt and some really excellent team therapists and Rhonda, and do a random outcome study, maybe with the patients on the Stanford waiting list or some such thing, so we can get a really respectable study out, and that's got to be priority 1 right now.
Who would you compare in the controlled study? People who are not in treatment, like you said, people on a waiting list?
You could do a waiting list control, or you could just do an antidepressant control group. Almost anything would be good. The research on my book, Feeling Good, I mean, there's a lot of research on my book, Feeling Good, formal controlled outcome studies, and they initially just used a waiting list control group. There's a lot of ways it can be done. It just, most of the team people are clinicians, are not researchers. And so I recently checked with a colleague who used to present studies to the Food and Drug Administration. And he's an expert in that area, and he's a great fan of my work, him and his wife, Malcolm Fletcher, and his wife, Louise Glenn. And they're really neat people. And because I'm working on this app, and we had the thought, well, maybe we'll do like compare it to an antidepressant and present it to the Food and Drug Administration, because we think we can outperform easily antidepressants and pretty easily human therapists just with the app. And he got all excited and he said, yes. And he says, now, do you want to do a large study or, medium-sized study or something like that? I said, well, it doesn't have to be a large study, just, something would be big enough. And he says, well, that would be about $150 million to do that.
Wow.
We'll say 50 or 75 patients take Zoloft, and 50 to 75 or 100 are referred to the app. I mean, they're just super expensive. Mm. If you do a really formal thing. So it's a bit daunting, but we absolutely will not get credibility until we get a good controlled outcome study. So thanks for that question. There's a lot of process research that led to TEAM that I published in top psychology journals on how psychotherapy works. And those were very credible and exciting studies, and that's what led to TEAM. But now we've got to prove it. As somebody said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary research.
Well, maybe if there's a listener to this podcast who's connected to a university and is a researcher and would be interested in participating in a controlled study, they could contact you. Yeah.
If somebody would like to take the reins, I'm happy to hand them to you, because I don't think the people who create a form of psychotherapy are the ones who should test it. Mm. Because all they'll find out is that the therapy is better than mashed potatoes or French fries. But the question is, can independent investigators confirm that? But you'd have to have well-trained team therapists in the team group, to my way of thinking. Mm-hmm. Also, the other thing is I have 22,000 team therapy sessions that I'm going to analyze this summer for patients treated at the Feeling Good Institute, where I have data at the beginning and end of session. There's probably about 2,000 or 3,000 patients and probably about 100 therapists and 20,000 separate sessions that I'll analyze. And I've analyzed half of it already, and it's fantastic results. And both the process research and the outcome research, but I want to replicate it. I have 10,000 more now that my son sent me. And so if I can see if the original findings are fine, because I never like to publish something unless it's replicated.
I can add one data point there. Dr. Barr Taylor invited me when I was a resident to publish a chapter in his book, Evidence-Based Psychotherapy. Oh. And at the time, it was very new in my practice, but had a very interesting case of a woman with severe postpartum depression. It was very severe, and she was quite had been quite dangerous prior to coming to see me. And we could measure using the brief mood survey the results of her therapy sessions with me, and she was concurrently getting ECT. And so we could see the differences in her mood there, and the therapy sessions compared favorably.
Matt, could you explain to the listeners what you mean by ECT?
Finish your sentence first.
I forget where I was. So ECT.
You're going to say something compared comparably.
Yeah, to ECT.
Yeah.
The ECT would have a very rapid positive improvement in her mood and reduction in her depressive symptoms. That was comparable to what a therapy session was offering her. The ECT it's basically inducing a seizure.
Brain damage.
Unfortunately, it causes memory loss in many people, and you have to go into the hospital and get anesthesia in order to induce the seizure, and it's effective, but also it wears off quite rapidly. Mm. And the nice thing about the therapy was that it showed progressive improvement over time. Like there's a clear learning curve that she was just getting better and better with the therapy. Yeah.
Awesome. I think the mechanism of change in ECT is the memory impairment. They can't remember their negative thoughts.
I wonder about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's brain damage. is the memory impairment. And so what was the degree of brain damage from the TEAM sessions?
Hopefully minimal.
That's fantastic. That's cool, Matt. Could we have time to squeeze in one more here?
Yeah. What does rational emotive behavioral therapy fit under?
It was the forerunner of cognitive therapy, created by Albert Ellis in the 1950s. And then Beck kind of picked up on Ellis's work and called it his own, and called it cognitive therapy. But they were both based on the same premise that thoughts create feelings. Beck took more of an academic route with research, so he gained much more academic credibility than Ellis. Ellis had a very powerful popular following, and his approach was more kind of extreme and bombastic, whereas Beck emphasized empathy. But I loved Ellis. I knew him a little bit. He was always so kind to me, and he was a crazy guy. He was a wild man, but he was a tremendous visionary. He was brilliant, and the thing I loved about him is he had integrity, and he didn't take ideas from others and call them his own, and that made me really respect him and admire him tremendously. But they're like very similar, like cousins, cognitive therapy and rational emotive therapy.
We do have time for one more.
Okay.
How does the cognitive distortion fortune telling apply to specific phobias as an anxiety disorder?
Well, you want to take that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of a case of someone I treated for claustrophobia. And he could clearly pinpoint the moment in time where the phobia developed, and he was under his house. It was a night. The pipes were going to freeze, and he was putting candles on the pipes so they wouldn't freeze. And he
that
had
sounds
this
like fun. Oh my
yeah,
God.
I think this is more common in the Northeast. But he was under his house, and he had the thought, what if there's an earthquake and the house collapses on me, and I'm trapped under here and I can't get out. And he quickly scurried out from underneath his home. And ever since that point, he would avoid and be afraid of enclosed spaces, including elevators. And I think the phobia was really locked in by that avoidance behavior, by
right, that locks it.
The belief that I survived only because I ran from this.
Yeah, and the thought is, in this closed space, something terrible is going to happen. We'll have an earthquake, and I'll be crushed, and that's the negative thought. And when you do exposure, my argument is that definitely almost all exposure is a cognitive technique. It's not a behavioral technique. It's the improvement comes when the patient doesn't run from the fear and discovers that the negative thought that's the entire and only cause of the fear is a wrong thought. And the moment they discover that during the exposure, then the feelings instantly change. There may be some forms of exposure that are pure behavioral exposure without a cognitive component. I don't think so, but it's possible. But the main thing is that all anxiety results from fortune telling, telling yourself that something terrible is about to happen, and it's physiologically impossible to feel anxiety without that distortion. So that's why a lot of the techniques are designed to crush those thoughts that you're giving yourself. Like, when you have a panic attack, you say, oh, like the one I presented in my talk, I'm on the verge of death because my chest feels tight. Well, let's do some jumping jacks and find out if you're on the verge of death. And then in the example I gave in the lecture, this woman, after several minutes doing jumping jacks, she said, I wonder if I could do this if I was on the verge of death. And her panic attack disappeared, and she was cured. Like in 15 seconds, you could see her recovery on the video after 10 years of failed therapy for panic attacks.
So that's a fantastic example. I think a lot of the what ifs, once the phobia is locked in place, is the prediction that I will feel anxiety and it won't go away. Like it'll just be a terrible experience for me to go into this enclosed space now. because I'll have this terrible anxiety. And that is, I think, true. Like the anxiety will be experienced briefly, and then it will go away.
If you're intentionally bringing it on.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're avoiding it and trying to get away from it, it won't go away.
Excellent point.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Matt. This has been a joy having you today. And
my pleasure. Thank you, Rhonda and David, for having me back.
And thank you, Dr. Knows. You said very, very little, but we did appreciate having you here. Well, you are very, very, very welcome. Yes, absolutely. I approved of everything you were saying. It was very deep and illuminating.
Well, we start with a laugh. Now we're going to end this podcast with a laugh. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And until we see you again.
Goodbye.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.